This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Qiana Whitted, who teaches in the Department of English Language and Literature and in the African American Studies program at the University of South Carolina. In addition to numerous articles on African American literature and graphic culture, she is the author of 3 books: A God of Justice, The Problem of Evil in 20th Century Black Literature from 2009, EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest from 2019, Desegregating Comics, Debating Blackness in the Golden Age of American Comics from 2023, and is the editor with Brandon Costello of Comics in the U.S. South from 2012. In this conversation, we discuss the place of material culture in Black studies, the meaning of graphic and comic book representation of Black life, and how an expanding sense of a Black studies archive impacts the field. Hello, Qiana. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk to you today about Black studies, about your own work in relation to the field. I really love the sort of work you do. I think it's really important for both the study of Black literature, Black life, and Black studies. And so hearing your thoughts on the field, about its past and future, but also about your own work in relation to it, I'm just really glad you made the time. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
So before we get into talking about Black studies, so your imagination of it and your own work in relation to it, I wanted to start with really an invitation for you to talk about how you got interested in Black studies and more broadly to the study of Black life. Like, what drew you into this? Like, what's your own origin story and what sustains you in relation to this field of study?
Well, I have always been a reader. I'm one of those people who, as a kid, even always had a book in hand. And I am the type of person who, I will read anything. So it was science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, vampires, vampire romance. Like, it was all the things. And that was sort of my window into different ways of thinking and being that I didn't even realize, as a kid. So I love all of these things. There wasn't a whole lot of Black literature that was introduced to me early on through school, but as I started to read more and explore more, I realized that, there's some things that people believed were too dangerous to put in print. Mm-hmm. And that idea really, I realized even in thinking about this interview, how much that idea has stuck with me. Certain forms of representation, whether print or visual, being too dangerous, too incendiary to put in print. And of course, as a kid, I'm like, well, it's words on a page. What's the problem?
Yeah.
But I was coming of age about 11 or 12 years old when The Color Purple came out. And I don't know if you remember all of the controversy and the drama over the film, the special episodes of, was it Donahue, and all the things. So I wasn't allowed to see that film.
By the way, just to interrupt you, this is the 3rd time Donahue has come up in these podcasts. So I just have to say, but it was a real moment for a certain age. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
That's right. So yeah, I wasn't allowed to see that film. And I think I was about 12 at the time, but my grandmother, who had an extensive library, her thing was romance and Westerns. I remember she had a copy of The Color Purple and saw that I was looking curious. And she said, go ahead. Just, let me know if you have questions. I'm not sure I would have done that with my own 11-year-old daughter, but I think about those moments as being really formative in my life. And in that respect, exposing me to things that, yes, what does it mean to put this type of story in print? And the impact that it can have. Obviously, there's a lot of sexual assault there. There's also really fascinating things with language, with religion. And that stuck with me for a really, really long time. And so in terms of my origin story, I guess to that I would add, I was one of those English majors. I went to Hampton University, which was a university that an HBCU, obviously, that had been in my family for multiple generations. And so I was really proud of that, proud of my history. But besides a few things that I've had read, not really as acquainted with some of the academic study of Black studies and African American literature. And like many of the people who I've heard on the podcast, I didn't know Black studies was a thing at first. And I was fortunate to have a number of professors who, even though we didn't have a program or an official department at Hampton, they worked those titles into our classes. So the first time I read Invisible Man was in a world literature class, and it was the only novel that we read. Or I read Their Eyes Were Watching God as part of a senior seminar theory class. And so that kind of opened even more windows and doors into some of the possibilities of literature. And that ended up being my, it sort of motivated me to go to grad school. I went to Yale University, and I majored there in American Studies and African American Studies. Yeah, so, and I mean, I can say more about some of the things that I did in that respect that led me to Black studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. You know, this I say this almost every time in response, but I love hearing these origin stories in part because of how different they are, right? Sometimes it's a parent's bookshelf. Sometimes it's a family member who has a kind of politics, something on a street corner, someone on a street corner selling books. And, it's really, we only record the audio, but in some ways I wish we had video because I'm just looking at your books behind you. And it's like, when you were talking about this, the curiosity and the sort of open imagination of your earliest engagement with books, I would read anything, I think you said. It's kind of like you have a version of that behind you. And that's such an interesting way to get that path first sort of navigated through the lure of imagination and along with other things, I'm sure around like politics and culture, as you said, about like things that are dangerous to have in print that somehow people think like forbidding them like pushes kids away rather than towards. But that function, that place of when you were talking, that place of the curious imagination, even from childhood, is so interesting. And that's something that I think the academy for sure, but even graduate school can so often grind out of us.
Absolutely. It is a different way of looking at literature, at creative representation when you get to grad school. But for me, I sort of switched gears a bit away from some of these genre fiction interests that I mentioned earlier. But I never lost sight of that idea of representation and risk. Sort of like people who take chances and say things that we think they're not supposed to say. And so in grad school, I went there thinking that I was going to study 19th century slave narratives and historical fiction about slavery. I still do a little bit of that. But what started to fascinate me more and more was the number of people who were saying things about God in Black literature that, again, they were told was inappropriate or blasphemous or, again, dangerous that they should not say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking here about Langston Hughes,
Mm-hmm.
beloved by who doesn't love Langston Hughes, but for a time after he published Goodbye Christ, people did not want to they uninvited him to talks after that. Hurston, right? Of course, James Baldwin, even Toni Morrison. And so as I started to do this work in grad school and sort of take notes on this, and this is where Black studies becomes so important, I veered off into different territory, into
Mm-hmm.
religious studies, philosophy of religion. And so I'm taking these wonderful classes with Robert Steptoe and Hazel Carby, and Elizabeth Alexander was there. But then I also had a chance to spend some time in the divinity school
Mm-hmm.
and do some work that ended up being my dissertation in my first book.
I love that. That's, having adventure in graduate school. Like, I mean, just listing off some of those names, I'm like, oh, wow, that's a great place to have studied. But I love that sense of adventure in graduate school rather than simply, I think I'm sure you'll have a lot more to say as we go along
Sure.
about how Black Studies opens those kinds of things up. But let me ask you just, about this phrase, Black Studies, this field, Black Studies, and ask you about your own picture of it and how you imagine it. And I ask that in the context of its origin story, right, which is really twofold, right? At the same time, it is a movement motivated because of the lack of the study of Black life across disciplines. And in the late 1960s, as an extension of the Black liberation struggle, post-civil rights, there's this demand, like the campus be different, the curriculum be different, the classroom be different. And Black Studies has that as one of its origin stories, right? It's a place where you can study Black life, right, without having to battle English departments for what counts as literature, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has that deeply political and community relation, right? That sort of blurring of the line between the campus and community. That was a part of the politics, not just the cultural politics, but the political struggle for Black liberation. And so there's that part of the origin of Black Studies that is about prescriptions and political intervention. And so, that's the late 1960s, early 1970s, and we're in 2024. So, I'm curious how you think about the field of Black Studies and how you think about it, particularly in relation to this origin.
For me, I think about Black studies, again, coming from my own various disciplines in the humanities, about the way that the political and social issues that you've referenced are expressed creatively through story. Or, like right now, I mostly study comics and graphic novels, and there's a lot of ways, satire, cartoon art. There's a lot of different ways that the things that we stand for and believe in and want to study are articulated through story and representation. I think too often when some of those images or ideas don't fit a particular narrative, again, I'm thinking here about some of the religious dissent and an unbelief that I referenced earlier. They get left out. And one of the really good things that I've noticed and seen in the last, however, I've been doing this 20 years, is that we are big enough and there is room enough for dissent, for other views, and for people to say, we can no longer leave these other aspects out. So yeah, I'm noticing that expansion has been a really nice development in interdisciplinary study more generally, but in Black studies in particular.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think that's such an important way of thinking about it, and I hadn't put it in those terms about the, part of the success of Black studies is making that expansiveness in which we can have arguments, and it's not discipline or area study destroying, right? Because it can feel like that in moments of crisis. But I like that sense of this being a disputable space, right,
Mm-hmm.
rather than a battle for what's real and what's not. I think people still take that position very much in the field, but you're right that we might want to reflect also on how the fact that we're having these and it doesn't dissolve arguments and it doesn't dissolve departments is a good thing. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, we teach, I don't know, I'm sure for you as well, we teach the debates, like in our surveys, in our Intro to African American Studies classes, in my literature classes. But there's something quite nice about going through the usual Du Bois versus, Malcolm X versus, and then also knowing here are the places where they also were on the same page, or couldn't just get it together, and it was fine, for others to come along and pick up some of those battles. So yeah, I mean, it can be expansive.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the thing about the I think some of the lingering memories of early formation and even inside disciplines around you have to defend the idea that African American literature is real literature at a certain point, but then at another point you kind of now just engage in what is literature, right? What is a literary piece?
Mm-hmm.
That's a different kind of dispute because it's taking place in this case, like what is the proper orientation or sensibility of Black studies. It's great to be able to teach those debates as debates, and
Mm-hmm.
students love. My experience, students love those debates. They have more passion about that than just about anything else, which I always find really interesting. I was like, you're like 4 weeks into learning about Black studies,
Yes.
but suddenly like you're ready to brawl over Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Washington, Du Bois, and all of that. I love it. Yeah.
But it also teaches them too that they can disagree, and that there isn't a single way to read these materials or to respond politically, ideologically to them. It's like it gives you permission, a kind of permission, to disagree, and that's a good
Absolutely.
thing. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask about your work. It's this really interesting mix of cultural studies, of literary study, and of course, as you were just saying, graphic arts, comics, graphic novels, and so forth. And I just think it generates so much insight for the study of Black life that's really new. But I'm interested in hearing you reflect on your work and how you think it relates to the past of Black studies and what sort of horizons you think it opens up for the field.
Sure. Well, I started getting into the academic study of comics and graphic novels after I had gotten out of graduate school, had my PhD, and was teaching at the University of South Carolina. It was something that I thought I did only in my free time, read comics,
Mm-hmm.
and enjoyed. But then I realized when I was looking for a summer class that could entice students to remain on campus. If you know how hot South Carolina is, nobody wants to be on campus during the summer.
Yeah.
So I picked comics, did the research, and realized there's this whole other field here of academic study. There's scholarly journals, there's academic programs, institutional programs. There was not a lot of folks, though, doing and speaking about race and African American representation, with a handful of very important exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Those were harder to find. But I realized that a lot of the questions that I ask of the literature and cultural texts that I study in African American studies were also relevant there, in comics.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of the newer comics that were coming out, whether they were nonfiction comics about King or about Nat Turner, or superheroes, which is only one genre of comics, but they are part of it
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so I think one of the wonderful things was being in a program where I could, again, like with religious studies, take another detour. This has been a 15-year detour, and talk more about comics and graphic novels. But I will say, as you mentioned, it's has not been something that has been traditionally part of our of the academic field, in our curriculum. And that's not just for Black studies, that's more generally, that's starting to change, but it hasn't always been seen as I don't know, when I say legitimate, or just that there was something there worth studying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, of course, I think about the study of the Black Power and Black Panther movements, how significant the study of posters has been. But it's interesting when you're talking about graphic arts and African American literature, like that those two things don't match up, you know? So
Right.
because asking sort of what are the horizons that you push on and press on, and then sort of where do you situate it in the past of Black studies? On the one hand, what I heard in what you were saying is that it feels like kind of a break with the past, you know, it's like a real new horizon. It's also interesting that it wasn't a natural outgrowth for the field, right? Because the study of newspapers and
That's right.
and posters and political art, right? But I think maybe that's the thing, the political art, and then we talk about the politics.
That's right. You are correct to point to things like political cartoons, editorial cartoons, even comic strips. I mean, I as I'm sure many know about the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender for a long time. It's a big part of our history and our work that we do, but didn't realize until I started doing more in comics that they had such a active and dynamic comic section, with regular cartoonists who were hired specifically for those papers. The Courier had their own inset for a little while, like about a year or so, of color comics. Cost a lot of money to put that together, and they had an audience who wanted to read it. And so, the same people who are, as I've said in some of my other work, responding to, we'll take Emmett Till, right? In a newspaper like the Chicago Defender or the New York Age was another. A few years later, to see a comic strip talking about Emmett Till, which Tom Feelings did as part of his series, Tommy Traveler. To me, that's really fascinating, and I want to put that in conversation with what's happening in other sections of the paper. And that comic strip I just mentioned was from 58.
Okay. I mean, it's funny, just hearing you talk too. It's, I often talk to graduate students, and they're sort of like, how do you find like an important new topic? How do you and they imagine like it's always something hidden, but I was like, you'd be surprised how many things are sitting right in front of you.
Yes.
Because what you're talking about is like, you go to a bookstore, it's on the shelf, right? You open up the newspaper, it's sitting right there. It's like sometimes these like new innovative things have been right in front of us all along. And so the real question is, how did we and why did we not notice this as an intellectual community? Yeah.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I had a student who brought me, I tell this story a lot, but who brought me a photocopy of a comic called The Guilty, which I ended up talking about in my book on EC Comics, that tells the story of a Black man who's been accused of committing a crime, falsely accused, and later ends up being killed by the sheriff. And this is a main character, African American, not drawn like a minstrel figure, talking about issues that are really serious and urgent in the moment in which it's published. And that came out in 1952.
Wow.
And so my student hands me this, and I'm like, where did you get this? What is this? Who put this out? And I'm thinking about what's happening in 1952. I mean, that's when Invisible Man comes out. And so we're talking about two different texts, but we're also talking about two different audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not always overlapping. And so I'd like to think that there's room in Black studies to bring those two together, different
Yeah.
purposes, different techniques, different media, but that are in conversation about Black life and history in important ways.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I like that. I really love that way of putting it. Yeah. Thank you. And so, I mean, you've already spoken to this, and in some ways, you've led right to this next question. I also wanted to ask, about your own educational and now work trajectory. Right, your PhD work was in Department of American Studies and African American Studies at Yale. Now you're in a Department of African American Studies and also an English department. So you've worked, really heavily in terms of your training in area studies, but also work in a discipline. And so I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about your research and teaching and how being, so deeply rooted in African American studies, but also working in a discipline, like how that's impacted what you write, what you think about, and how you teach, how you create a classroom.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm fortunate to be at University of South Carolina in a place that has an African American Studies program that has been there for so long. So it's over 50 years. And at one time was dominated by historians. Like that was how Black Studies was articulated, was through history. But in recent years, we now have ethnomusicologists and anthropologists and sociology, criminal justice, art history, all of the things.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this was, not that I feel, we know this was one of the goals of Black Studies, not just to create its own separate unit, which is very, very important, but to demonstrate that what we study and our interests and our investments can be applied to any discipline, right? And that there is already places in the English department where Black Studies should be. And so it's been nice to be able to see other units welcome joint appointments for that reason. My English department happens to be one that contains like linguistics and speech, and so it's already MFA programs. So it's already fairly interdisciplinary for an English department.
Yeah.
And that's been helpful. I know a lot of places don't have the same, but so that's allowed me to teach a lot of things in and out of literary studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because disciplinary demands, they really do shape our scholarship and
right.
can impact our interests. Sometimes people are deeply in a discipline, but as you said, I mean, I think even English, I mean, you're describing, an uncommon, though I wish it was common, right? Collection of study of language and literature.
Right.
But it's an interesting question for me to ask, like area studies discipline when people are English professors, or at least partly English professors, because English has become so multidisciplinary minded and interdisciplinary minded, and it's already, it's not quite an area studies in some ways, but in some ways it kind of is. I look at English classes here, and it's like films and poems and comics and performance studies and theater and art. Yeah. So let me ask you a big speculative question. We're talking about, 5+ decades of Black studies. And when you look back on it, what do you think that Black studies has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Well, I feel like some of the opportunities I've had a chance to build on here, for me, show the possibilities of Black studies. And I've already talked about, my relationship to English or to comics or to religious studies. I think that's a big plus. When I teach the Intro to African American Studies, the survey, though, I'm fascinated by how many students, um, as I mentioned before, when they hear about that goal, that Black Studies should be its own thing, but also should be welcomed into other departments and disciplines. That second piece, outside of these few humanities and social science departments we've mentioned, that second piece is much harder. We have a lot of students at our school who, like most places, are thinking about learning outcomes and career options and things that they're going to do. They're in the business school, they're in the sciences, engineering. And Black Studies isn't always making it to those places.
Yeah.
Those places are still, one or two faculty, no courses in the curriculum, only special topics or occasional lectures, if that. And it's not just here, elsewhere as well. So I wonder sometimes about that other kind of, for lack of a better word, proselytizing that I think some of the founders of these programs, especially at predominantly white institutions, had hoped that scholars would be able to do, for a range of reasons, including administrative challenges and, administrators who don't understand Black Studies, that expansion, that proselytizing. I wish I could find a better word, but that's not happening as much as I thought it was. And I see that when I work with students in my intro class. They've never heard of some of these things, even things that are relevant to their majors, these figures, these debates. I'm happy they're in my class because that means I get to introduce them to these topics. But yeah.
I like proselytizing. I like
Is
that
that
term
where?
better. I mean, I was a religious studies minor, and it's always kind of stuck with me. But I guess it's your divinity school journey also. But no, I mean, I think it's better than advertising because I think it does convey the kind of seriousness. This has been a struggle for me, having been in Black Studies for 20-something years at this point, how it gets taken seriously. And I've talked with people in past podcasts about battling constantly against this idea that Black Studies is like a clubhouse or a support system rather than a serious field of study. And I like the clubhouse, whatever. I mean, that's my word, but that I do like the idea that Black students feel like they come to a Black Studies class and they don't have to battle for their own legitimacy in the classroom and so forth. But the seriousness of what we do, and that being a surprise even to students, I think it goes to the, we need our curbside preachers or whatever the proselytizing is, like pamphlets. We do serious work over here. But that's part of the work of the classroom as well. And you hope it spreads word of mouth because you can get a C in Black Studies.
That's right. I give out some of those. Yes.
Well, let me, you started to talk a little bit about this just now. And so I want to maybe focus on it, talking about the future of Black Studies as well as its origin point. And so this is really like a big future speculative kind of question. But it's like, one of my questions is, how would we index the success of Black Studies? Like, what is an indicator of our success, right? Is it to have so transformed the disciplines that those disciplines become unrecognizable in terms of what they were at the origin of Black Studies, which is had little or no representation of Black life, so that they now represent Black life in the study of literature, history, sociology, criminal justice, etc. And so in that way, maybe part of the destiny of Black Studies, if it achieves all of its aims, is to in some ways not exist at all. To have so transformed the disciplines that we don't need Black Studies, right? That it's infused and changed those disciplines. But then there's the other question for me, which is the future of Black studies more properly understood as, coming to a diverse set, but some set of methodologies that are distinctively Black studies and are really unabsorbable by disciplines, right? To become in that way kind of like a discipline. And so the future of Black studies is to be its own thing rather than to ultimately have done its work through changing how disciplines understand themselves as scholarship and as teaching.
That is a great question. And I'm tempted to say the both and, but I know that I have come up in and developed that second model that you've talked about, the sort of the clubhouse or whatever term we're using, but one that honors and values a very distinct set of concepts and ideas, thinkers, debates, as we've said before. I think it's once we do that, once we establish that foundation, is when the branching out, as I've done in my own career, I can do so with a kind of confidence and just an ability to know that this is, as you said, this is already legitimate. This is already valuable. I have the fortune or misfortune to have been in this field of Black studies, which already has its issues with legitimacy from the outside, to combine that with comics. But people don't really think that comics is worth studying either, and put them together. It's a hard case.
I hadn't actually thought that you were actually between two legitimacy struggles, but yeah, go on.
Right. We spend a lot of time in comic studies defining what it is and why we do it, which is a familiar story. So, I mean, I guess I'm saying this to say that I have benefited from that model as a grad student, as a scholar. But the other piece that you mentioned, the first piece about, is the goal to actually do so well that we almost don't exist anymore because Black studies has become a part of these other units and interests. I see that goal. I can see the value in it. And it is unfortunate, as I mentioned before, when my students haven't gotten any of that information. And so I would like for that to be the case, but I don't know. It makes me a little nervous. So I want to hold on to a bit of what we have, that foundation, that home base, maybe rather than clubhouse, maybe home base.
Yeah. Home base, that's much better, yeah.
Home base. Yeah, and then when you see not often, but when you see these days, sometimes the willful misunderstanding of area studies, right? Then you wonder and worry, what could we have done differently? Is it really just, well, everything's a cycle. So we know that people willfully misunderstand for political, ideological reasons all the time, whether it's debates over critical race theory or, again, some of the things happening with quote unquote area studies. That to me says we need to be in more classrooms that don't have the label Black studies on them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, the political, just even as you were saying, at the level of political strategy, the significance of being in disciplines is just massive, and I really can't be understated. And it has been amazing, which is just a synonym for terrifying in this case. Amazing how quickly the field we're in has become dangerous.
Right.
Whereas our previous struggle was being neglected and under-enrolled and underfunded, and so suddenly we're underfunded, neglected, under-enrolled, but also the most dangerous. I say it all the time, but like we can't even get students to do the reading for so many class sessions. How we became like brainwashers. I was like, I want to brainwash them to read the whole novel.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I
Yeah.
distracted myself there for a minute.
No,
But
no.
but thinking about, I mean, this is a thing that comes to mind. I've mentioned this in other podcasts as well. One of the things and I don't know what I think about it, but one of the things that struck me about this question about, the future of Black studies and is it to become more and more robustly its own thing or to be dissolved into the disciplines it's transformed, because we have really transformed disciplines. I mean, especially English and history departments are unimaginable, I think, at this point without the Black studies effect.
Absolutely.
There's always more push to go, but it's very real. But, we have collections of Introduction to Black Studies, that's Black Studies texts. Right. But we don't have collections of Black studies methodologies. Right. And so those kinds of questions that often define a discipline, we don't have those in Black studies, and I'm not sure what to think about it. But it's sort of, for me, a lot of where the question comes from. Are we just such a collection of different things that it's not even a coherent question to say, is there such a thing as a set of Black studies methodologies? Or are they there and they sort of are there for us, like I was saying about the way the comics are in the newspaper that everybody's studying. Are these methodologies just laying there to be articulated and studied? And, that's just behind the question for me, because I'm not sure what to think about it myself.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think what comes to mind when I hear you say, where are the concepts, the methodologies, I think about one of the first books that I read in my senior theory seminar class in undergrad, and that was The Signifying Monkey. When I was coming up, that was the book everyone was reading, and people have since built on it and picked it apart and all sorts of things. What I've always taken away from it that still sticks with me today is the notion of Black culture being one that stands on its own, even as it takes into account and signifies on, remixes, revises the narratives that have been set out for us. So takes those master narratives and finds ways to negotiate and navigate within them, through them, outside of them. And that process in itself feels like one of the methods, if we want to call it that, to return to. I also think, and this is one of the things that when we think about the institutionalization of Black studies, like around the 60s and 70s, I tell my students that, before that, we still had Black studies in different ways. And so when Baldwin or Richard Wright or others are writing reviews and essays, they are having conversations about Black studies without calling it that. And I think it means something that some of our practitioners are also some of our most cherished theorists or critics. And that doesn't look like a lot of, it doesn't always look that way in other fields.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just when you were listing off those words, I'm looking at sitting on my table, somebody returned to the Keywords in African American Studies book. I think that when you listed off those terms, I was like, I would love a keywords and Black Studies methodology, right? As you said, like remix, I'd add like lower frequency, all of these things. I love that. Just when you list it off, I'm going to go back and listen and actually write those out, because I love those as ways of thinking about methodologies rather than like, quantitative, qualitative, right? But like remix and the way the jazz player and the DJ are as much practitioners of Black studies as the essayist and the poet. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a final question. Thinking about Black studies in an institutional context, what do you think is the question that we should all be asking? What is the thing that we should all be thinking about?
Ooh, what
Or
is
that you
it?
would love us to think about? Right. Ought to be is maybe too strong. That you would love us to all be thinking about.
Well, I feel like one of the things I keep coming back to are different ways to bring Black studies into our everyday lives. I think that's how I try to make it relevant for my students. And that can mean something as ephemeral and temporary as a comic book that gets passed around and falls apart. Um, it makes me think about um, the work of Tia Miles and about that sack, Ashley sack, where she took a sack from an enslaved woman who was giving it to her daughter and does this beautiful reading of the thread and the seeds inside of the sack and all sorts of things. For me, that sort of everyday, quotidian level, thinking about where Black studies, where we can bring it with us, um, is important because I sometimes for my students, they're psychology majors, and this may be the only Black studies class they take is with me, and I want to give them something to take with them uh, wherever they go, and so I would hope that that could be sort of the charge for one of the charges for us going forward.
I love that. I'm actually moved by that. I just like, what do we give them to carry with them? You know, what is that sack that they cradle,
Yeah,
that they pull out, that they consult, that orients them or challenges them or surprises them? I love that. That's a wonderful place to conclude the conversation. So thank you generally. This has been really thoughtful and really interesting. I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness in this. And ending with that, I think that's a charge that we all really ought to think about because it's
thank you.
September. We got months and months ahead of us of
We
teaching,
do.
and this is a way of being reminded that what we're doing is not just grinding it out. It's also cultivating things that can be sustained in other people. So I love that.
Thank you. Thank you for
All
inviting
right.
me.
All right. Thanks so much and have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye.